Andrea is the State Policy Associate at the National Association of State Directors of Career Technical Education Consortium. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you want to just mute your phones to eliminate any possible background noise, and then also the PowerPoint and recording of this webinar will be posted at careertech.org following this webinar, and we'll have links at the very end of this webinar pointing you to all of the appropriate places. And so with that, I want to give a special thank you and shout out to our webinar host, Cisco, and Krista with Cisco is on the line. And so if you have any technical issues at all, please just use the chat box in the corner to ask her any questions, or you can throw it into the Q&A, whichever is easier for you, but that would be in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. This webinar, we're going to first talk about why we're focusing on employer engagement, and then we're going to unpack the findings of our newest report, the second installment of our State of CTE series, focusing on employer engagement. And we'll talk a bit about federal policy, some state policy levers, and then the types of employer engagement activities. And, this time, we're actually going to have a bit of an interactive webinar, and we're going to have some live polling. And we're going to have 2 questions kind of near the end, so keep your eyes out for them, and I'll walk you through how we're going to do this. But this is our chance to hear from all of you about what you think on employer engagement. And then finally, throughout this webinar, we encourage you to be sending us questions and answers that we'll be using at the end of our presentation to really have a robust conversation about employer engagement. And do that by submitting it through, again, the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen, and just send it to everyone, and we will get it. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists for today. First, we have Kimberly Green, the Executive Director here at NASDCTEc, Scott Stump, Dean of Career and Technical Education for the Community College System, as well as he's also our NASDCTEc President. And my colleague, Steve Wojtek, who's the Government Relations Manager here, and then, of course, again, myself, State Policy Associate. And with that, I would like to go ahead and pass it to Kim to go ahead and start and tell us a little bit about why are we talking about employer engagement today. Canvas? While we were working on just a couple of issues there with her technical difficulties, Steve, can you tell us a little bit about just the methodology of the paper and how we went about this?
Sure.
I'm sorry, actually,
okay.
With us.
Hi, I was on the phone, but apparently technology doesn't work, but my legs do, so thank you for letting me crash your party, Andrea. First, I just want to say thanks to Andrea and Steve. They were the authors and researchers and voters of people to get the survey done, and it is their hard work that we're all able to share today, so thanks so much, guys. So the deal with employer engagement with CTE is not a new one, right? CTE, even in its prior conception, vocational education, didn't really exist without having employer engagement. I mean, that is their definition. CTE is a partnership between education and employers. That's why when in 2010 our organization gathered the state CTE leaders from across the country, as well as national stakeholders, to craft a vision to guide the future of CTE, one of only 5 principles really focused on this important partnership between CTE and employers. So in the vision document, we both acknowledged the historic and essential partnership CTE has with employers, but we also spoke about the importance of evolving this part to really reflect the current and emerging economy and the educational enterprise. So in 2010, it's important to remember that, we were in a very different place than we're at today. The economic situation was different. We were beginning to talk about college and careers, and even technology was very different in terms of thinking about kind of how to use that as a platform for teaching and connecting. So the process we took to develop our vision forced us to look really hard at the global trends, as the data was telling us, and to listen to what employers were saying. Essentially, the vision called for upgrade in the relationship with employers that CTE had, away from one that was simply advisory in nature, where perhaps we convened employers a couple of times a year and told them what it is that we're doing on their behalf, to really shifting to a partnership where employers were true collaborators, co-developers, co-owners, co-implementers. The vision also called for education employers to work together on the issue of credentials. And obviously we know that is an issue that still remains a priority today. And we were really calling for CTE programs to have an opportunity for students to earn stackable credentials that were transferable and recognized by employers. So for us, it's clear that this issue of employer engagement was part and parcel of the vision that we had for the future of CTE. Clearly, our vision led us in the right direction, but as you'll hear in the paper today, there is still more work to be done. One of the levers that we have to move this work along is the Perkins Act, the federal investment in career technical education. And we know from previous research that Perkins is the tail that wags the dog for secondary CTE and has a strong influence on post-secondary CTE. Right now, other than a few mentions in the plan development section of Perkins, the law is largely silent as it comes to requiring employer engagement. Because of the skills gap, the interest gap, continued high unemployment for certain segments of the population, and recognition of skills and education being key economic drivers for individuals and our nation as a whole, made the issue of employer engagement in alignment to programs to labor market an issue that will be surely central to the reauthorization of the Perkins Act. The challenge that this debate brings forth is the issue of balancing long-term and short-term needs of the labor market. How many times have we all sat in audiences and heard people say, today I have to prepare students for jobs that don't even exist? Well, this calls for flexible, adaptable skills like those found in the Common Career Technical Core, not narrow, highly specialized job-specific skills. This brings about a caution in this discussion as we think about Perkins reauthorization, and that is the caution of balancing K-12 education's career exploration responsibility with preparation for specific skills for specific work. So we know that we need to do a better job of aligning program offerings in the labor market, but filling current job openings isn't necessarily the same as connecting talent and interest and building a robust, literate pipeline of future workers. So finding this right balance is an important challenge before us, but be central as we think about the reauthorization of Perkins. But I think Perkins is really going to be a real opportunity for us to be able to build on and perhaps close some of the gaps that we are going to hear today in this paper. So with that, thanks for a chance to give a little bit of context, and I'll turn it back over to Steve.
The introduction, Kim, and for that really valuable context there. I want to turn now briefly to the methodology of this report and give everyone an idea of how we approach the subject of employer engagement in CTE. It really began earlier this summer with one central question in mind. What does employer engagement in CTE look like throughout the country? Secondly, but equally important, we look to explore what the state's role is in fostering and expanding these activities. And we surveyed NASDCTEc's core state director membership in August of this year for responses to a series of 14 questions on this topic. 6 states and 1 territory responded. We conducted a dozen formal interviews with relevant stakeholders, such as employers, state directors, relevant state staff, and key national leaders. But really, we need to turn now to what is employer engagement. So for the purposes of this report and for this webinar, we broadly defined employer engagement to mean any type of formal collaborative activity between CTE and employers. These activities can range widely in scope and intensity. The term employer is an umbrella phrase that we use throughout in a wide range of entities, including business, industry, organized labor stakeholder groups, others, all from the small and mom-pop enterprise on your local street corner, all the way to the large multinational corporations that we run into every day. So when we speak about employers, we really mean the whole spectrum of small, medium, and large enterprises. With all that, let's now turn to the core elements of this report. As a bit ago, a central question in this project was exploring ways in which states foster and cultivate employer engagement within CTE. Federal legislation, namely the Perkins Act, is the primary policy tool available to states for this purpose. As primary national investment in CTE, the Perkins Act reinforces CTE's central role in maintaining the country's economic competitiveness by ensuring that CTE programs are linked to high skill, high wage, high demand, and high growth occupations, in part by promoting and helping to foster the partnerships between the CTE enterprise and employers. As mentioned towards the beginning of this webinar, balancing the various interests and needs of all stakeholders, students, programs, and employers is an ongoing challenge. Policy must address the many different realities, economic, geographic, and otherwise, experienced by states and local communities to effectively craft policies that can promote employer engagement across the country. To achieve this, Perkins was crafted in a way that allows for some degree of flexibility for states to determine how best to leverage the legislation when seeking to foster employer engagement. We identified 3 primary leverage points in the law for this purpose. The first such point is contained at the very outset, as Ken mentioned during the development of a state or local Perkins plan. Perkins requires both state and local grant recipients to develop plans for how the legislation will be effectively used for a specified period of time. During the development of such plans, state and local recipients are required to consult with representatives of business and industry, along with a number of other stakeholder groups. While employee input into the development of individual CTE programs is not explicitly required under current Perkins law, it is important to note that many state and local recipients have undertaken such efforts, particularly through the creation and use of local advisory committees, which we'll be speaking to more in just a bit. The first point we identified falls within a state leadership activities set aside under current law. Perkins allows states to use up to 10% of their overall allocation for statewide CTE initiatives, including, in part, support for partnerships between CE and employers. To a survey NASDCTEc conducted in the earlier part of this year, a majority of states reported using these funds to support such partnerships, and an even greater number indicated that these funds were used to support programs offering work-based learning opportunities. Finally, and most interesting for our purposes, states also used the law to establish additional eligibility requirements for low Perkins grant recipients. Use Perkins for this purpose in 4 key areas: requiring employer participation on local advisory committees, the opportunity to participate in work-based learning opportunities, employer-led or provided professional development for CTE instructors and administrators, and finally, monetary or in-kind contributions on the part of employers. Advisory committees were by far the most common additional eligibility requirement states indicated establishing for local Perkins grant recipients. When we were into these results, we found that LACs can vary considerably in shape, size, and composition. The common thread among each of these was the formalization of employer input via this framework. The existence of work-based learning opportunities, such as internships, mentorships, apprenticeships, along with employer-led activities for CTE instructors, administrators, we classified as professional development, and were among other requirements a handful of states indicated recently adding to Perkins local grant recipient eligibility. These figures may seem low. It is definitely encouraging to see some states committing to the importance of these activities, particularly in light of the resource-intensive nature for both of them, and because other obstacles such as concerns over workplace liability on the part of students and possible capacity concerns on the part of employers. Only 2 states reported requiring in-kind or monetary matches from the private sector for grant eligibility. We likely conclude here that there are difficult matches to leverage, particularly if a clear ROI cannot be established. Sustainability of these in-kind and monetary contributions something over the long term that also cropped up during our research as a primary concern with these. And we'd like to hand it over to Mr. Scott Stump, who will speak to some of the innovative work currently underway in Colorado. So the microphone on the right-hand side.
All right, while Scott tries to work out his technical issues, one of the things that we had asked him to speak to was actually some guides they had put together to help guide those local advisory committees, which are the committees that have business representation on them. Oh, Scott, Kara?
Andrea, sorry about that.
You can say this so much better than me, so go ahead.
Well, there you go. So worked on my technology a little bit. Off we go. Yeah, it does make all of the difference. Yeah, and I would say we fall into that category that Steve just outlined of really the first 2 bullets there. With our actually in state law, it does require the committees for our secondary programs, but we had no guidance on our post-secondary programs, where we did leverage the use of Perkins to include for all eligible recipients that they do have a technical advisory committees advising their programs for the programs to be eligible for this fund. In addition to that, we also do require work-based learning experiences, although we do not define in all cases how those take place, but that does hopefully encourage that relationship with business and industry. But so we have that requirement. In our case, in our handbook, say they have to be 50% business and industry. They have to meet 2 times a year. But 4 years ago, as a result of some desk monitoring work that we were doing, we started to notice consistently that programs were not having meetings. They were maybe one a year. And then as we got to looking at the agendas and the minutes, we were concerned about the quality of what was actually taking place in those meetings. And so we did work with Cord and Deb Mills at Cord to build a new advisory technical resource. And so it is posted on our website at cccs.edu or coloradostate.com. And under all the CTEs or administrative resources, you'll find the advisory committee guide and all of the tools and resources that one need to operate and start up or ramp up an advisory committee. Or then we have seen, an increase in the use. In fact, I was visiting with a group of administrators on Monday. There was about some of the tools in there that they had actually had their instructors do self-analysis, which there is a tool for that to see where they're at in this world. And they were very excited about where they're at with those and seeing an increase in compliance. We have more people actually meeting. But at the same time that has been happening over the past 3 years, we have been spending a lot more time working with our Department of Labor and our Workforce Development Governor's Work Council and development arm, and having questions about, well, okay, if we're facilitating a local conversation in one school district or one college or one community, but all of the other assets and attributes of the state for economic development are working more at a basis, so the small sector partnerships. Do we take our advisory committee conversation from beyond just being compliant and the evaluation of applicants for student organization officers or watching a presentation to really having that deep engagement and conversation about for businesses in our area to evolve? What are the sets that we need different than we have today? And or what are the positions that we're struggling to find applicants for? And in mass at an institution, so not just within my program, but then all of the current tech programs with our institutions, how to bring students to a rest in those areas, or how do we get them onto a track to go on to post-secondary education, either at the community college level or at the four-year institution, to be walking into those positions. And so we're finding is that whole regional sector partnership approach really doesn't fit with some requirements because we don't necessarily need to have business individuals gather twice a year. If we have one 2-hour really deep conversation with them, we're going to drive our programming probably for the next 2 to 3 years. So it starts to raise some questions about our current policies that we have in place and driving effective conversation that really truly get to deep employer engagement, or we pulling on the methodology that served us well historically that does position us well in the future for success. So I'll say we've got a great resource. We are happy with love all the local program conversations that are happening. We are at a point where this document did force us to ask the question, how can we move forward and what serve us well for the next 15 years? The rest of this conversation. And Andrea, I'll let you continue it.
For that. So we're going to transition and move on to state policy. And states are using many different ways to foster employer engagement in CTE. And really one of the most valuable aspects of this report really is the treasure trove of state examples that came up through both our research and interviews and the survey that we conducted. And so one of the questions we posed to states was to identify the types of policies and programs that they use to foster employer engagement in CTE. And as you can see here, the most common tool was this interagency collaboration, with 42 states saying that in some way they are engaged in interagency collaboration. And this ranged from informal meetings where CTE is increasingly having that seat at the table, being brought into conversations, to being a member of the state's workforce investment board, or even to be explicitly have CTE be a part of the state's economic development strategy, such as in New Jersey. And so I will talk a little bit about New Jersey's talent networks. This is this focus on the specific needs of 7 key industries, from advanced manufacturing to healthcare, and they represent the greatest opportunities for high-wage, high-demand jobs in the state. And the goal here is to connect these key employers with education, workforce development agencies, and others to identify the skills that prospective employees need to succeed. And through this, the state's CTE office has really enhanced its own collaboration with employers and other agencies, and this further helps to ensure that industry needs are informing the development of CTE programs across the state. The second most common method, state said, were through pilot initiatives. And a great example of this is in West Virginia with their simulated workplace program. And this was a pilot initiative that started in 2013 with just 64 sites. And the idea is essentially to turn the CTE classroom into a company and actively bring the workplace within the 4 walls of a classroom. And the program structures the CTE course as a student-centered, simulated experience that exposes them to standard practices tailored to the industry that they wish to enter. And there are now pilot sites within all 16 career clusters within the state. And industry partners actually helped work directly with the state to design this program, and also serve as inspectors that visit these classroom-turned companies once a year to ensure that they're meeting industry standards. And the pilot is now entering its 2nd year with 240 sites and is on track to become a permanent program within the state. And also, the third most common way was through competitive grants. And now sometimes, of course, pilot initiatives and competitive grants can be one and the same, and there is some overlap in categories. But an example we wanted to share with you came from Iowa, where they recently had a $1.45 million grant competition to strengthen work learning in the state. And using the state's 15 community college regions, the initiative created a statewide network of intermediaries that connects secondary, post-secondary employers and other community stakeholders to create and sustain a range of work-based learning opportunities for all students, because by using those regions, they were able to get full statewide coverage. Now, although those were the top 3 most commonly used levers, there were also some underused strategies, and those included tax credits. Now, there were some examples out there. For example, in Alabama, they have recently passed a tax credit to help enhance dual enrollment. Also in California and Maryland, they have work learning tax credits that they offer to employers who offer these opportunities. And then finally, actually, clearinghouse. This strategy, we got no responses on any state saying that they utilize a clearinghouse to foster employer engagement in CTE. And related to this, we had a question on the survey where we asked the state directors whether they collect information fully on local programs, employer partnerships. And then half of states said that they do this in any way. Now, however, if states were to collect this data fully, and some do, it could be an opportunity to really uncover best practices and compile those into a clearinghouse and then push them back out to the locals who are looking for a resource and looking for ideas of different ways that they could foster employer engagement. And another common form, in fact, one of the most common forms of employer engagement is often through standards and development and credential selection. The way that employers can participate to advise on the credential technical skills assessments that should be used in CTE programs. And in fact, 43 states said that employers are participating in at least one of these processes. For example, in Tennessee, input from the industry advisory councils and other key labor market data was critical during its ongoing CTE standards revision process. And in Kansas, actually, employers essentially drive the process when it comes to credential approval through participation in the state level business and industry committee. And so as you can see, there are many ways in which states can and are leveraging employers and also doing so in a meaningful way to improve CTE across their state. And with that, I would like to turn it back to Steve to tell us a little bit more about the types of engagement activities that are out there.
Thanks. So, as mentioned, in addition to the state and federal leverage points that we've just identified, we also examined the many ways in which employers are already engaging within the state CTE system. A better sense of the landscape, as it were, we posed questions to state CTE directors asking what the most common employer engagement activity was in their state. I had the ability to pick more than one answer here, so the categories you see on this chart are duplicated. But we did make a distinction between secondary and post-secondary learner levels, while also seeking to gauge whether or not these activities were occurring on a statewide basis in some local areas or not at all. Our report really wasn't concerned too much with initiatives that weren't statewide in nature, which is why those last two categories are not included on this chart. Nonetheless, these activities seek to achieve a number of state priorities, including strengthening alignment of CTE programs to the labor market, improve overall CTE program quality and offerings, providing students with meaningful learning experiences, among other important CTE objectives in a given state. Rather than doing these simply for the sake of checking a box, we identified these activities as having the largest impact on a state's ability to successfully promote and expand employer engagement in a systemic fashion. Back to this chart, we see that the survey results for the secondary and post-secondary levels largely mirrored one another. One exception to this rule was employer engagement through statewide CTSO activities. I found that this drop-off between post-secondary activity at the post-secondary level compared to the secondary level was largely attributed just to the high concentrations of secondary students in many of these organizations, comparatively speaking to the lower concentration or lower amount of students at the post-secondary level in CTSO organizations. A bit more deeply into the other results here, we can see that state-level advisory committees were, again, the most common statewide employer engagement activity. Important to note that the governance structures and responsibilities of these LACs, or local advisory committees, vary considerably. Just as I was mentioning a bit ago, a great example of this is Kansas's Business and Industry Committee, which provides input from employers for the purposes of preferred credentials. In other states, these types of activities can and do differ in scope, depth, and composition. But what doesn't is the formalization of the process for employer input at the state level. And so really that's the connective thread that we found here with these state-level advisory committees. Profession was another area states indicated seeing quite a bit of statewide employer engagement activity. In Texas, for example, employers in certain industries have led a statewide externship program for the state school districts. More recently, this has involved both CTE and academic instructors alike, a study aimed at promoting the integration of academic and technical instruction through cross-disciplinary projects in the following academic year. On the list, we see certain activities such as career guidance and advisement, work-based learning opportunities, and monetary or in-kind contributions from employers begin to diminish in terms of statewide prevalence. As also discussed, a lot of this is probably due to capacity concerns, both on the part of employers and of the state. Whereas these activities are perhaps the most time and resource intensive of the bunch, making bringing them to scale a bit more challenging than the activities that are at the top of this list. I'd like to turn it back over to Andrea for our first live polling question of the day that will look at this very activity.
All right, thank you, Steve. So we, like I said, are making this a little interactive today. So if you are at your computer, you will see that I just opened our first poll. And as I'm speaking, feel free to actually ask or answer the question. You'll see, sorry, excuse me. You'll see that the question is, from the list below, what are the top 2 employer engagement activities that have the greatest benefit for students in your state? And again, we ask you to pick your first 2. And thank you for those who have already started doing this. Again, encouraging the top 2 employer engagement activities that you believe have the greatest benefit to students in your state. For those of you who are on the call from an association or a policy organization. Give us your opinion generally of what you think are the top 2 employer engagement activities that have the greatest benefit to students. And we'll open for maybe another 30 seconds. I see that folks are finished questions, some are in progress. Right, well, they're I'll close the poll and we'll be able to see the results live. Not individual responses, this is just a get, of course. As I'm giving us a few more seconds, so if you haven't, you still have 10 seconds. All right. I'm going to show you the poll results. And you can see that work-based learning is off the charts, so 49% believing that's the top. And then for the second, it looks like we have two, actually they're close enough that I'll give them a tie, and that is CTSO engagement as well as state-level advisory committees. So thank you so much. That was very fun. That was my first poll that we've ever done. All right, so moving on, and we'll have a second poll in just a bit, so you'll have another chance if you missed this one. Now, moving on, we also asked the state directors about the change in employer engagement over time. And we asked them over time from the past decade, moving to the next 5 years, how has employer engagement changed and how do they anticipate it change? And overwhelmingly, they said that they've seen employer engagement increasing and even more so believe that it's going to continue to increase over the next 5 years. You know, giving credence to this idea and that employer engagement is important and it will continue to be important. So we need to be engaged in this process and understand everything that it means. So with that in mind, although it's increasing, it doesn't mean, however, that there still aren't some lingering challenges out there for educators and employers as they do continue to partner. We identified some lingering challenges. These are just a sampling of them. And so although employers and educators often share a common goal and vision, at times it can feel like each of them are speaking their own language, even though they're talking about the same issue. And this idea of a language barrier we really found was kind of a lingering challenge that continues to be worked through, sometimes successfully and sometimes unfortunately to the peril of that partnership. It's not so successful. And so coming to shared understanding really gets everyone on the same page and really gives a power and strength to the partnership and the work that can be done. And part of the language barrier can come from competing views of long-term and short-term, just as Kim mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. Issue that we saw repeatedly was the issue of time. And the fact is that a partnership of any sort takes time, and no one ever has enough of it. And when it comes to education, you know, that includes the teachers, the administrators, the employers, and even the students and their class schedules. Time is always an issue, but one that remains to be worked through to the benefit in the end of students and their preparation. And then also achieving intensity, and meaning that it's not enough just to have a few shiny examples in a state of employer engagement, but rather achieving employer engagement at scale. It can be very difficult. And in part, we hope that this report will help to give states an idea of the full range of tools available to them so that they can connect all students with valuable and meaningful experiences. And Scott, I'd like to bring it back to you to you know, talk a bit more about these lingering challenges, because it's all well and good to talk about the great things happening, but we need to recognize too that there are challenges. And so if you could speak to that.
And I would say that over the past 18 months, and a lot of legislation from 2 years ago, that our state legislature directed us to build a pilot career pathway in manufacturing. And so the first part of that was engaging all of the manufacturers across the state in 5 growth summits. It brings back the language barrier was the funniest one on the top of the list there, and I can concur that from having standing in front of them. And, you know, The business and industry really does not need to or want to completely understand what it takes to get a credit or what it takes to get a certificate or how many contact hours are required to get one credit or how many hours of seat time. All we really care about is the output. And sometimes we get lost in education and all of the wonderful language that we use. And ultimately, we also feel like we can always, solve every problem. We're educators, and so the one thing we learned the most out of that engagement process was we need to be quiet. And we formed, manufacturing regional committees led by business and industry. They really truly do all of the talking and set the agenda. And it's very hard to resist. Our instructors and faculty at the K-12 level and college are directed to really listen and try and gather every bit of information we can from them. And that's been a big part of regaining the trust of our business industry community, because in some cases over the years, they felt like they've contributed, but nothing has changed because we mentioned, say, well, we hear you, but we change that because we have to do it this way. Well, we're trying to get to the action beyond the talking that we faced, and actually has caused the process to take longer than we would have hoped, but really has been valuable, is really focusing on a state, regional, and local alignment and collaboration between not just education and business industry, also our workforce partners, because every workforce center has a business shop that's only calling on the businesses they're saying, what kinds of employees do you need? And the educator goes and says, what kinds of employees do you need? And the economic developer goes and says, what kind of employees do you need? And this person has limited time to begin with, and they're going, okay, stop, get together, have a good conversation collaboratively, invite me in once for that conversation, make good, effective, efficient use of my time, and then deploy and that information into all three of your systems so you can give me the workforce ultimately that we need, not just to sustain our but to grow and to meet build the economy of our area. But I will tell you that is not as easy as it sounds, because trying to coordinate meetings between our state workforce center and office and the economic development offices, it did make it so it just took a bit longer. The thing I would share is then the policies, ultimately looking back at those. And like we talked about before, the question on, committees, at least they have to meet twice a year. Is that valid? We've actually got some administrators in the state that are going to take that up in the local level and really start thinking through maybe one meeting, efficient use of their time that guides well what that program is doing in the year ahead. Can develop our policies and what we require. Those would be one of the challenges that we're going to have to look at and say, how can we, as always, do things better and move along? And one of the challenges we're facing.
You really appreciate that. Now, again, just as a reminder to folks, our question and answer session is coming up in just a few minutes. So you go ahead and start putting in your questions for those of you who haven't already. We've already had some come across that are really great. But now is the time for our second of two live polling questions. So again, let me go ahead and open this. All right, so you can see the question that is here. And the question is, what is the greatest challenge to fostering employer engagement at scale? So, opinion, what is that greatest challenge to fostering employer engagement at scale? And again, this can be balancing the immediate needs of the labor market with those long-term goals, the lacking of time, developing that lacking of a common language, also lacking the accurate data to really know what the labor market wants and needs. And if there's an issue that's not listed here, go ahead and select that. Folks are doing it. We've got lots more coming in, and for those who have finished, again, you can start in the Q&A, sending us your questions. Steve is going through them as we speak. All right, I'm going to give you about 10 seconds. You still have time, 15 seconds actually, before the poll closes. right, fine. For our results, the greatest challenge that folks could see is the idea of time, which of course is, I always say this every day actually, can't we sit through 2 more hours in this day? But lacking of time, and after that, the balancing of needs, that long-term, short-term balance. Good. Thanks for that. Okay, so now from here, Steve, why don't we go ahead and go on to questions.
Sure. So one of the questions that came through was actually during the webinar, and it was actually during your part of the presentation. It was asking what state has the competitive grant been used for in our example. Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. So one of those examples is Iowa, as I mentioned, and they had that statewide intermediary network for work-based learning. And another one that comes to mind immediately is California, who has the Career Pathways Trust. That's the competitive grant program out there. And one of the things I'll mention here while we're talking about this is this compendium of state examples that we have compiled. It's a 2-page list of all sorts of state examples that are out there from across the states, including this Career Pathways Trust, the link there so you can learn more about it, as well as the Iowa example.
Great. Yeah. Andrea, next question we had was regarding sort of barriers to employment for CTE students. So I think this goes back to sort of what we were talking about earlier in terms of the ability of employers and states to really craft opportunities for students to participate in basic learning. The most common sort of barrier to creating those opportunities, at least highlighted by employers, were liability concerns. So hiring an individual who's under the age of 18 a lot of times opens up to a greater degree of liability from an insurance standpoint. So that was definitely a challenge and a concern that many states are grappling with right now. I believe in Georgia, they are currently working on legislation to over that specific obstacle, and I know a few other states are also looking at possible options as well. So again,
can I jump in on this one? I mean, the other challenge that related to employment for CTE completers is that if the completer does not have a degree but only has a non-credit certificate or industry-recognized credential that doesn't have the visibility within a community, then doesn't send the signal to the employer of what areas that individual has competency in. And so I think the issue of credentials, in particular related to HR managers. I recently was at an event where we heard that CEOs are talking about the importance of industry credentials, but when you talk to HR managers, job descriptions are written for degrees. And so there seems to be a major disconnect, and one that could be a significant barrier for those who go through a non-degreed CTE program.
Great. Here's
Is anything else to add on that question?
I concur with Kim that as we were going out to the manufacturers, it was funny. The employers themselves, or the managers, did say that as they would spec out the job, they were listing out the skills they were after. But when they handed it off to their HR department, they would come back with a associate's or bachelor's degree when really the person actually doing the hiring wasn't necessarily looking for a degree, but it was being used as a gatekeeper path. And so that has to be a part of the conversation and really saying with those employers, how do we signal to you that this individual is ready? And with all of our energy employers in the state, Excel Energy, Tri-State, and Blackstone, to put together an Associate Arts degree program that is common so that all of the energy employers know and can recognize that and value that the hiring point, because that is a critical piece of the puzzle.
Great. A question that we kind of want to throw out there for both Kim and for Scott, is what do you think is the most important element of a successful CTE employer partnership? Kim, thoughts?
Well, I guess I would say that I think there needs to be mutual benefit. Scott recently had a chance to go on a study tour to Switzerland, and when we were there, Switzerland is widely heralded as having a really strong employer education relationship. And one of the things that we saw there, I think that perhaps lesson learned here that can answer this question is that because every student who was in a CTE program had a work-based learning experience. It did a couple of things in terms of the relationship between education, the employer, and the students, which I think is an important customer in this that we often forget. The first thing that it did was that it kind of changed the dynamic and the valuing of one another in the partnership. So we from the employers, and they said, by having young people in our workplace, we have had gained a kind of appreciation for the quality of the work that they can contribute, and really that they brought fresh perspectives and creative ideas and really do demonstrate a good work ethic and have contributed to the bottom line of our company. On the other hand, the students found great understanding about what they were learning in the classroom by being able to apply it in the workplace, and we've known that in our country for a long time. But the less was that it really also impacted kind of what was happening in the classroom. And so the dynamic of bringing employers into the classroom and having them not only be much more visible in setting the standards, but really being what we saw in our vision paper, co-owners of the system, I think a new kind of dynamic and relationship of equal respect, equally valuing the roles and relationships between education, employers, and the students. Scott, have anything more or another observation to add on what we saw in Switzerland?
Yeah, for prior to Switzerland, the work with the manufacturing community, and I will tell you the one thing that needs to happen in that relationship is that there needs to be action. We heard from two manufacturers that had been a part of an advisory committee at some point or other and had made a request or had said, hey, can you think about this? And say that in our education community, there was no response. And so as we went along in this process, we've been very sensitive to make sure that as we have heard the requests and the different thoughts, at least having that conversation about, okay, here's how we'd like to address that, and keeping that conversation going. But ultimately, business industry is very results-oriented. I mean, they are on very short time horizons. That when they get a new product, they move very quickly for it. And that's one of the pieces that I do think in this relationship of employee engagement, we're going to have to be better at having a more timely response and ensure that our programs continue to evolve, and that because that will enhance that relationship. To go back though quickly on the, if I could, on the liability question.
Absolutely.
The other piece to that we didn't mention, but is in our law, and there's just copies of it, but we're also taking workman's comp, a big one about who has to cover the workman's comp side of things. And the other piece to that then is, and this does go back to the Switzerland visit, but we spent a lot of time looking at the question of if we really truly wanted to do kind of a youth apprenticeship or a traineeship, what Switzerland was able to do was to make an incentive for the employers by allowing those employees to go in at a low cost, knowing that they would not be 100% productive when they started the first day. So they start at $750 a month, which is way below minimum. That is a receive income in that process and experiences, and allows for the workers' comp and all the other pieces to be paid. So, that's one of the things that we're currently looking at, is to say, how can we work within those labor laws to make it labor that is inappropriate use of labor by the employers, just getting cheap labor, but make a meaningful experience that does have, like an apprenticeship, a provision of payment where the student is incentivized to continue to learn along the way.
Moving on, we have another question here from Brett. Going forward, do you anticipate an increased focus on employer engagement in the areas of state policy or legislation? Would you answer that one?
Absolutely. I think that's already starting to become clear. Great examples of that is in Alabama, they recently were able to get through a bond issue last year, and that really was a big part with their partners, really helping to take the case of CTE to the legislature and being a champion for CTE. Another example of that is in New Jersey this year, where there's an employer coalition that's come to help a segment of the CTE technical high school there, and have started to get some bills through the legislature. They're waiting to see what the governor's going to do with them, which we should find out in a couple of days, actually. But another example is also in Rhode Island. That happened again this year. So I think that there are employers that are interested and they want to get involved. I think it's also key, though, for CTE, the folks who know CTE and understand it, to get in front of those employers and partner with them, so that any of the actions that they want to do, really goes to being truly beneficial, and that it's really informed, et cetera. That there's a place for both people to be involved, or both groups to be involved in that. But I absolutely think that this is going to be something that you will see going forward, both at the state level and actually on the federal level too, for that matter.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just Scott, if I can jump in. I also would just put up for everybody's ear that the whole WIOA, so the new Workforce Act, also that mentions career pathways many times and through, focus on strong business and engagement and cohesion in there. So whether or not, no matter how Perkins ends up, it has already started at the federal level in the WIOA as a part of this notion of really focusing on strong engagement.
I would just add, this is Kim. The Governors Association has an initiative that looks at the intersection between education, workforce development, and economic development. Monday, Scott and I served on the task force with the chief state school officers. They released a set of career readiness recommendations. The first recommendation is about increasing employer engagement in this issue. 42 to 43 states have already signed to those recommendations, so I think that underscores whether or not it's formal policy action. Obviously, this reflects a strong area of interest that chiefs and governors are going to be focusing on.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question coming in from Sasha. Many states make funding contingent on districts providing work-based learning opportunities, and if so, have some districts lost funding because they couldn't build up that critical business engagement? So a question that we had posed to our membership regarding this particular one was the prism of Perkins. So it was talking about how states were creating additional eligibility requirements above and beyond what's required in federal statute. Our members indicated rather that 8 states had been doing this. I can follow up with you specifically on that one. But in aggregate, 8 states indicated that they were doing that already, part of their plan or their application process for Perkins. Definitely some concern, particularly in districts where you don't have the opportunity to create learning opportunities if you don't have the necessary employer base. It's definitely something that states, report back as being a big barrier to expanding that as a requirement moving forward. So definitely something to take into consideration. We look towards Perkins reauthorization.
Steve, I think I can just say also, though, anecdotally, that, there are, you get this question from Sasha 2 ways. There's whether or not people have lost federal funding, but there's also the question within the program approval process that states have of how do you, do your programs reflect kind of employer engagement, or is there some connection to employers for state funding? And I think that the issue really that's at heart here is, whether or not we have some better connectivity to the labor market, and in my perspective, and I think we saw this in a number of kind of key data points, that having a better connection is important. And then second is that getting students the opportunity to do work that is real and meaningful and is not just kind of simulated, but is in fact something that they can see that they're contributing to the workplace. As I mentioned in Switzerland, I mean, there was a dramatic difference in the maturity and the how proud the students were when they were in the workplace as compared to doing some kind of made-up activity in the classroom. And so I think that often we limit ourselves by saying, you know, we have to look at only the employers that are in the local community. In California, there was a program with Acme Animation where the students were doing work online, and obviously animation is something you do on the computer, that real professionals were able to judge and evaluate that work. So does it have to be actually in a physical workplace? No, but I think having an opportunity to have employers develop real-world problems and evaluate student work is really what this is all about.
Couldn't agree more. I think it's definitely important, too, to make that distinction between categorical funding at the state level compared to the federal level and all of the different strings that are attached for both of those funding streams. Scott, anything to add before I move on?
Yeah, I was going to jump in there that as one of those states that does require work-based learning be an opportunity for a program to be approved and getting access to both state and federal dollars, 100% support what Kim just laid out, that those opportunities make all of the difference. And after what we saw, the experiences where 80% of the young people grades 10 through 12 in Switzerland have some apprenticeship, a work-based learning experience. It makes a huge difference in the notion of what work is and their readiness. And if you want to get to true career readiness, having that experience takes you a long ways down the line. A couple of years ago, when our governor had a blueprint bottom-up approach, he brought together industry councils in 14 industries. And all of them said that we need more work learning experiences for students. And ultimately, what came out was that they were saying students were not work ready. You know, we are at the highest rate, actually lowest rate of youth employment of whole-age students in the U.S. history. We're down about 30%. So that means 70% of young people, when they go to apply for their first job after they leave high school or college, have never had employment before. And that's a serious issue, because that's why business industry are saying kids don't know how to work when they come to us, because they've been coached at McDonald's. They've never been told, okay, thrown away, it's not the time to do it. And so all those things are the experiences that are critical in the preparation of our individuals for that workplace. And so work-based learning to me is probably the one priority as we move forward here in Colorado in the next couple of years.
Right. Just being cognizant of time, we have a couple minutes left, so I want to turn it back over to Andrea to wrap things up today.
Absolutely. Well, we want to point to our upcoming webinars that we have on the calendar, but also I want to point to past webinars that we've done, because one of the questions we did not address due to time was about the value of badging, and we actually just did a webinar on badging with employers on the webinar that you can listen to. You can find it on our website at that same URL that's there at the bottom. So you would like to save the date, we have two upcoming webinars. One's on state strategies for CTE financing. This is the new report that just came out from the National Center for Innovation in CTE, and also uses data that we collected here at our organization. But it will be 2 p.m. Eastern Time, January 15th, 2015, so in the new year, and it will be co-hosted with the National Conference of State Legislatures. Also, we will have a second employer engagement webinar, because today we were only really able to dig into the contents of the report, but this time we're going to bring in state perspectives, once again, besides Scott, who did a wonderful job today, but from the folks Alabama and Kansas, who you'll see featured throughout the report, to talk about what they're doing, how they're doing it, and they'll dig into some of those specific activities. And to point out we have an Excellence in Action Award. This is going on right now, and we encourage you to go to our website, careertech.org, to find out more about it. But this will recognize and honor superior CTE programs of study from around the nation, and these selected programs will exemplify excellence in the implementation of the career clusters and having this meaningful impact on student achievement and success. The deadline to apply is Thursday, December 18th. We have just extended that deadline, so there is time. So please go to our website and check that out. And then you can find all of the reports and the resources that we've talked about today at the URLs listed below. We will be recording or posting the recording and slides soon, but give us just a bit to get that actually up on the website. And we want to give another shout out to our host, Cisco and Krista, who's been excellent today. And we want to thank all of you for joining us from all of us here at NASDCTEc and of course, Scott in Colorado. Thank you so much, and please send us emails if you ever have any questions, and we can be of help to you. And with that, thank you very much. Goodbye.